push that button. We are being recorded now. And for those that are watching this as a recording, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Paul McLeod, the Minister of Education here at Mount Calvary Baptist Church, and really appreciate you joining us. Also, the live students, welcome again. Thank you for pushing a few buttons and participating. And we've had prayer, and we've had a little icebreaker. We've had a poll, and kind of got warmed up a little. And I said this earlier to our live students, but this is going to be just a little bit different Bible study. What I try to do in most Bible studies is I do some talking. I try not to do too much talking. We have a DVD or some type of video, and I kind of count that as a guest speaker or something like that. Try to throw some discussion in there, because I really think that we learn a lot through discussion and talking about, what we saw, answering questions, going back and forth. By the way, last week was a great discussion. Really appreciated that. That helped, and I know it helped in my learning. And so I try to get a good balance of all those types of activities in there. This Bible study is going to be weighted just a little more on the video side, just a little more. And the reason being is that not only do I want to make sure we get some understanding of this part of the story where the battle begins. This is session 7, the battle begins. But I also want to introduce you to a couple of things, a couple of what I call lower story items. One of the items is geography. I'm going to play a video that introduces us to the geography of the Promised Land, the geography of Israel. And the other is kind of an apologetic, not apologizing for something, saying you're sorry for something, but a defense of the faith. This part of the story is kind of controversial in some parts of the world when you talk about Christianity. And so Frank Turek is a apologist. He makes his living, full-time ministry, going primarily to college campuses and presenting information. And in his audience, he may have atheists in the audience, people who don't believe in God. There may be agnostics, those that say we can't believe in God. He may have Buddhists. He may have believers in Islam, all kinds of people, and he answers questions. He'll spend an hour answering questions. So I'm going to play a video that talks about, is God immoral for telling the Israelites to go in and kill people? And that's the question. And we're going to take a look. We're going to take a look at that. We're also going to take a look at the movement. Of course, we had movement 1, which we're memorizing, and then we're starting to memorize movement 2. Speaking about that, we're going to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen. And if you take a look at your screen, you can see the 5 movements of the story. For those who you are not aware, if you're not aware, we are doing some memory work on the movements of the story. There are 5 movements. The Bible can be kind of chunked up, gathered up into 5 movements, almost like a play. There's the story of the garden, which is Genesis 1 through 11. There's the story of Israel, which is Genesis 12 all the way to the end of the Old Testament. The story of Jesus, where we get into the New Testament, the first 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We call them the Gospels. Actually, there's only one gospel, but when we talk about this genre, this type of literature, we call it the Gospels. Then there's the story of the church, which is Acts to almost the end of the New Testament, goes from Acts to Jude. And then the last book of the Bible is book of Revelation, and it describes, and it has the narration of the story of the new garden. And so we have these 5 movements of the story. What we've been doing is, through repetition and using keywords, we have been memorizing these 5 movements. And so we're going to say them once all together, whether you're on mute or not on mute. If you would, all together, we're going to say these. I tell you what, let's say them twice, and so we can really get them into our heads. So all together, let's say them. Ready, go. Garden, Israel, Jesus, church,
new garden.
Very good. One more time. Here we go. Garden, Israel, Jesus, church,
new garden.
Once you get that in you, no matter whether you're hearing a sermon or another teaching in whatever part of the Bible, you can kind of categorize where you are in the Bible once you know these five. So if you're listening to some preaching and it's coming out of the gospel, let's say it's coming out of the book of John, you can say to yourself, oh, okay, that's a gospel. That's the part of the story, and it's the story of Jesus. It's like, oh, okay, now I know where I am. You can kind of place yourself where you are in the Bible, in that part of the story. Now, for the first movement, we used to do this several times. We're going to go through it just once and then go through movement 2 twice. So all together, let's do movement 1. Here we go. In the upper story, God creates
the lower story.
His vision is to come down and live in a beautiful garden. The first two get God's vision and are escorted from paradise. Their decision is into the human race and keep us from community with God. This God gives a promise, not just a plan to get us back. The rest of the Bible is a story of how He kept that promise and made it possible for us to enter a loving relationship with Him. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, movement 2 is a little shorter. Should be a little easier to memorize, and we'll go over this all together twice. So movement 2, here we go. God builds a brand new nation called Israel. Through this nation, He will reveal His presence, power, and plan to get us back. Every story of Israel points to the first coming of Jesus, one who will provide the way back to God. You notice on your screen that there are 2 or 3 underlines, and in blue, those represent blanks. If you went through your study guide, your what do we call it? Study guide. Yes, your study guide. You notice that there are blanks for you to fill in. And so at this point, there's 2 or 3 of them. You can just fill them in from memory, and this just aids in you remembering movement 2. And so for the next few weeks, there's going to be a few more blanks each week. So here we go with movement number 2, the second time. Here we go. God builds a brand new nation called Israel. Through this nation, He will reveal His presence, power, and plan to get us back. Every story of Israel will point to the first coming of Jesus, the one who will provide the way back to God. Hey, you all are doing so well. That is wonderful. I did get a text. Let me see. Somebody texted me. Okay, on the down low. Okay, got you. All right. I'll take a look at that here in just a second. All right. What do we have next? Now, what we're going to do is go ahead and see the first video. The first video answers the question, was God unjust for killing the Canaanites? Now, why is this important? Let me just stay on this for just a second. Why is this important? There are many people outside of Christianity that have questions, good questions, fair questions. They may have heard stories about the going in of the Israelites into the promised land and killing a lot of people, and God told them to do it. And they may have a question about that, and a good, honest question. And we need to be prepared to answer that question as a part of our Christian witness. There are some people who are maybe a little more hostile. They say, hey, look, I don't believe in a God that will go in and tell people to murder. God is essentially murdering people. And we need to have an answer for that also, because if we stay silent, people may think that that is true, which it is not. But Frank Turek, again, he's an apologist. He's going to help give us some information. You can take some notes if you'd like, but help give us some information on how we could respond to someone in a conversation and they ask this question. So afterwards, we're going to talk about it. What I'd be interested in hearing from you after the video is what stood out to you most about what Frank Turek said. What really kind of got your attention, or what do you really remember the most from what he said? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, all the buttons are pushed. It should be really good. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and put everyone on mute so you'll be able to hear well. But you may want to turn up your device or turn it down. I'm not sure how it's going to come out on your end. So here we go.
So as I engage students on campus, we do a little outreach table sometimes. One of the things I find is they don't really have a problem with God existing. They're actually pretty cool with Jesus. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that disturbs them the most is the Old Testament portrait of God. Yep. And his violence, or apparent violence, the seemingly allowing women to be oppressed, the killing of the Canaanites, all of those things, and then all of a sudden we get Jesus on the scene. And so they're kind of confused about, okay, so I don't like God if he is like that. And Jesus must not be God because Jesus is not like that.
All right, excellent question. Let's deal with the Canaanite problem because it's the most difficult of all problems, I think. And the question is it immoral for God to kill the Canaanites? Because if you read the Old Testament, you get these periods where God is like, hey, kill these people, wipe them out. Now, when an atheist asks me this question, I normally stop and I ask them, if there is no God, why is any so-called Old Testament atrocity wrong? Because an atheist has no standard by which to judge anything objectively right or wrong. If we're just molecules in motion, if we're just moist robots, there is no morality. There is no moral standard. So an atheist has to steal a moral standard from God in order to say God is immoral. But the atheist does have a good question for us. To say, well, you're claiming your God is a God of love, why does he do stuff like this? So it is a fair question, so let's deal with it directly. My first question here is to ask this. Is God arbitrary, or does he give reasons for judging people in the Old Testament? He gives reasons, right? He doesn't just wake up like some sort of mafia boss going, Canaanites, I want them dead. No, he is giving these people warning after warning about what they're doing, and he wants to get them out of the land so the promised people can get in the promised land to bring forth the promised Messiah and save the world, but they're not cooperating. 400 years of this, and what was probably the worst thing they were doing? Does anyone know who that is? That's Molech. That's the metal idol that they would heat up. You see the fire here. And this metal idol would get really hot, and they would put their children on the arms of this molten hot God and basically watch their children sizzle to death. In fact, it's not just the Bible that talks about this. The Greek writer Plutarch, who lived in the late 1st or early 2nd century, writes about this. He says the drummers in the town would play their drums louder so the parents couldn't hear the screams of their own children as they're sacrificing their children to this idol Molech. Now, on every college campus I go to, An atheist will normally stand up and say, if there is a good God, why doesn't he stop evil in the world? Well, here's an instance where God does stop evil, and yet the atheists are complaining about it. You notice this? God's saying, you need to stop this. So why complain that God doesn't stop evil, but then complain when he does? Now, of course, they're going to say, well, God went too far. Why? Because now he's killing everybody, not just the adults who did this. Okay? Well, there's a couple of views on this. Paul Copan from Palm Beach University wrote a book called, Palm Beach Atlantic, called Is God a Moral Monster? And Copan believes that most, if not all, of the commands in the Old Testament that talk about killing everybody and wiping everybody out are what we call hyperbolic commands. Now, why does he think that? Well, say you go to Deuteronomy chapter 7. It says, wipe everybody out. And the very next verse says, and then don't intermarry with them. Well, how could you intermarry with people you've annihilated? You couldn't. Copan thinks this is ancient Near East hyperbole. It's done many, like we do it with sports. We annihilated them. Look, no, they're not wiped off the face of the earth. It's just a way of expressing a strong defeat. So that's what Copan thinks. Clay Jones at Biola University thinks, no, these are literal commands. Let's assume they're literal commands. Let's assume they are. Wipe everybody out. How do we deal with that? Let me ask you the next question then. Is God committing murder by ending lives on earth? When God kills somebody, does he murder them? I mean, God's going to kill us all. If God exists, he's going to kill us all one day, right? Or he's going to pull his hand away, we're all going to die. Is that murder? Is it? No, God can't murder anyone. He's the giver of life. He can resurrect life. We can murder because we're not the giver of life and we can't resurrect life, so it's wrong for us to kill people, but it's not wrong for God. It's not murder. He can resurrect people. In fact, God has the right to usher people into the next life, whether they are 2 years old or 82 years old. If Christianity is true, people don't die, they just change location. They just go from this life to the next life. And it's up to God when that happens. So, if these are literal commands to wipe everybody out for a reason, by the way, he's trying, as I said earlier, trying to get the promised people in the promised land to bring forth the promised Messiah, God has the authority to do that. Now, you might not like that, and I might not like that, but this is what is known as judgment. It's judgment. And God is just. Finally, the Old Testament theocracy, and it is a theocracy, was unique and temporary. It was not the ideal for all time, but the means to a promised new covenant. Here's Paul Copan's book, by the way. That's the book you want to get on this topic. Let me just read something he says here. He says, contrary to the common neo-atheist caricatures, the Old Testament laws weren't the permanent divine ideal for all persons everywhere. God informed his people that a new enduring covenant would be necessary. By the Old Testament's own admission, the Mosaic law was inferior and future-looking. The Old Testament, as I mentioned earlier, does not apply anymore. It only applied to Israel. In fact, the writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, says the Old Covenant is obsolete. What's the Old Covenant? Everything in the law from the Ten Commandments all the way through the book of Deuteronomy. You say, Frank, the Ten Commandments no longer apply to Christians? Nope, they don't. Unless they're repeated in the New Testament. And 9 out of the 10 are. The only one that isn't is keep holy the Sabbath. Why? Because Jesus is the Sabbath. He's our rest. Yeah, they're repeated in the New. They're binding on us not because they're the Ten Commandments. They're binding on us because they're repeated in the New Testament.
All right, that is Frank Turek. He is an apologist. He talks to a lot of college kids, anybody he can talk to. I've gone ahead and pushed the button asking you to unmute. Tell me what stood out to you the most about what Frank Turek said.
Well, what stood out to me was, as I was reading through the story, the 7th session, the same thing stood out to me as he opened up his speech saying, how could God kill? I mean, how could he have all of these people killed when in fact, you know, one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not kill, when he could have just waved his magic wand and make things happen the way he wanted them to happen. But I never thought of it in the way he expressed it, that God is the giver of life. And so he cannot murder. He cannot murder, because if he has someone killed, he could bring them back to life. So that's not murdering. So the only thing that I came up with was that he had a plan, and in order for his plan to take place the way he wanted it, he had to have the plan put in place, and they had to follow his orders and trust him that he was going to lead them through the way they wanted to be led through, or what his plan was. That's
right. Okay, so it kind of hit you the way it hit, the way Frank said.
yeah.
Hey, how
I said, how
is
could
God
he murder?
a murderer? Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
liked it. I liked it when he said people don't die, they just go to the next life. So that means that there is another life. So you're right, they don't die, they pass into another life.
Mm-hmm. That puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Especially for the children and the women who didn't participate in the war. That's what concerned me. But now, knowing that God is the giver of life and he can resurrect people, he just removed them from earth and sent them somewhere else. But they were no longer on earth. And he had this authority. So that makes me feel better, because I was wondering, oh my God, he's killed all these women
All these people.
and all these children, and these little children. But from what Tarek was saying, that's not the way it was.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he made it quite clear, and I believe he's right on in saying that it's called judgment. For over 300 years, probably almost 400 years, he had been dealing with these Canaanites. And by the way, Canaanites is a kind of a loose term that really means several tribes in the promised land. The Jebusites, the Gigazites, all those ites. You can lump them all together and call them Canaanites. So he'd been dealing with these people for 400 years. And they had been bucking him. They had been rebelling against him. They had gotten worse and worse and worse. I mean, to the point where they were sacrificing children. And you heard the description of Moloch, one of their gods, which they placed the baby in this white hot arms of a statue and cooked the baby to death. It got that bad in that society. And so God was dealing with them as a people. We're so used, I think, sometimes of thinking about God's judgment and salvation on an individual basis, but God deals with groups of people also. And so part of that judgment for them was using Israel as part of that judgment to go in, to cleanse the land, and to take the promised land. So yeah.
Even told Israel
Mr. Paul,
disobedient for a very long time. Even before they went in to destroy them, he told them. He said, I've talked to these people. I'm tired of talking to them, more or less. He stated that they had been disobedient.
Right.
Paul, in reading the Old Testament, it's been plenty of times when I read a story and I said, man, God don't play. He didn't mess around. And I was wondering, it would have been a lot worse. It seemed like Moses was able to kind of talk him out of doing a whole lot of things that he would have done. It would have. Was Moses the only person that was able to talk him out of some of his judgments and stuff?
Oh, was that a question?
The last part was, yeah.
Okay. Your voice kind of went up on the end. I wasn't sure if that was a question or not. Was Moses the only person that could talk God out of doing something?
Some of his judgments as far as getting rid of some folk and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Because even if God was going to kill his brother and sister.
Right.
And I think he talked him in, I think Miriam, what she had the leprosy, and he kind of talked him out of that also. And he talked him out of earlier, dealing with the people when they was complaining about stuff. But I don't know, I don't remember if anybody else actually was able to talk him out of any of his judgments.
Yeah.
Well,
Just,
Moses couldn't talk God out of not letting him see the promised land because he told him he wasn't going to let him see it. And he didn't let him. He wasn't going to enter into the promised land. He told him, I'm going to let you look at it. I'm going to let you see it. I'm going to let you see what you missed out on because you disobeyed me. So Moses wasn't able to talk God out of a lot of things. God's plan was God's plan.
Right.
And either you got on board or you got left.
yeah.
It seemed like he kind of went to him about some things, and
I see where
of course his plan was gonna be his plan, but still the way it is in the Bible, it seemed like that he was able to I ain't say he talked him out of it, but on one sense he gave him a plan. He said, hey, did you bring them all the way out here? They're gonna think that you brought them all the way out here to, that the Egyptians were gonna think this, that, and the other, that you brought them all the way out here just to kill them.
he reasoned.
Yeah.
That's what he reasoned with.
I mean, you can put whatever word you want to on it.
Right, but I agree with you. I agree with you. I thought the same thing.
And he didn't try to talk him out of going into the promised land. Moses just told him he understood. He didn't try to talk God into letting him go.
He understood.
Yeah. Moses and God had a very close relationship. Jesus. Moses and God talked face to face.
Yes.
So much so that God's glory
The only one that could.
is
The only one did.
And so there are the author of the books of the Torah does say that God relented, or in some translations it says God changed his mind. The right way to think about that, if you look at the whole Bible, is God, probably that God showed grace. That God is sovereign. I mean, he definitely doesn't need us telling him what to do.
Amen.
Although the Bible does give, I don't want to say an impression, but does show those times where it seems like almost like with your children, coming to you wanting something, it kind of turns the heart of God and he hears your plea. Or it talked about God hearing the cries of the Israelites in Egypt. And so he responds to that, but he responds always in his sovereignty. He always responds within his grace. And he always responds, remember, he knows what's going to happen. Not that he necessarily approves of everything that happens, but he knows what's going to happen. So yeah, Moses and God definitely had a very close relationship, to the point where, yes, God does grant Moses some things that he asked for from God, definitely. But talking about going back to God picking the Israelites to kill others, I think Frank Turek really hit on something when he said near the end about God's judgment. And we have to keep this in perspective because, and I've said this before, I think, to a number of people, sometimes we look at the Old Testament God as being harsh and cruel and like that father or mother that disciplines you. And then we get to the New Testament and we see a different God, a God of love, a God of grace, of salvation. But we have to remember they're both God. And we have to remember that God is both love and he is also judgment. And sometimes we get one weighted too much at the expense of the other. So we do have to remember that when God basically cut loose and aided the Israelites in killing the Canaanites, that was part of his judgment. And think about the creator of the universe has that right to do that. In the Ten Commandments, if you look at the original language, the original Hebrew, a better translation would be thou shalt not murder, not necessarily thou shalt not kill. And within the civil law of the Israelites and within the old covenant law, there was a difference between murder and killing. So just some things to keep in mind as we go through that. But I wanted you to see that up front. And I wanted you, because sometimes we get to this part of the story and people really, that's really an obstacle with them. That how could God, do that? And then also there are some people who need to be equipped to answer questions at your work, or you're hanging out with your friends, or you're at a family reunion and people ask about, how could God do this? And so that's part of what we're trying to do at Bible study, is equip ourselves in defense of the faith, apologetics, basically. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that really answers some questions that you had. If you have other questions, there's that book that Frank Turek recommended. You can certainly get a hold of me if you have any questions. I can point you towards resources, and we can have a great discussion around that. But I wanted you to be equipped in that, to make sure that you at least know that it's out there, and it's okay to have questions about that. Now, if you noticed in our icebreaker and our poll at the very beginning, one of the subjects under social studies was geography. And I did that on purpose. How many of you all remember geography from, I guess, elementary school and maybe middle school, maybe even all the way up to high school? And I'm introducing geography to you because I consider geography to be a lower story element. So in fact, what I'm doing is I'm introducing a kind of a new character in the story, a lower story character called geography, which includes weather. And so all these things happen on the lower story. God's got the upper story. He's working his plan. And we need to see, how does geography, including weather, play a part of the lower story? Now, we're not going to cover everything tonight. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to introduce more and more geography. So this is just an introduction to get you thinking about, how does God use geography? How does God use weather in his upper story plan? How does he show his power? How does he show his presence? And how does he show his plan using a lower story element of geography? And so I'm going to go ahead and show this video. You can take notes. And the question I'm going to have for you is, in your reading of the story this past week, can you think of anything that God used, like geography, terrain, the weather in the lower story to advance his plan? And don't worry, I'll go ahead and put you on mute. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Make sure go ahead and share. There we go. If you'll take a look at your screen and adjust your volume, we'll go ahead and get started. Bear with me for a minute. I want to make sure. There we go. Make sure to push the right buttons.
Shalom, and welcome to the Satellite Bible Atlas, video number 1. In this video, we introduce the general location of the land of Israel and how it functions as a land bridge between 3 continents. We recommend keeping your Satellite Bible Atlas handy, since you can pause the video at any time to look at the maps with better resolution and clarity in the atlas. First, let's note where Israel is located. The land of the Bible sits at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. It is a land bridge between 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. The land of the Bible is not a make-believe or fairy land, but a real place on our earth. The Bible is a record of real events that happened to real people at real places. In a nutshell, this is the message of the Bible. The divine or transcendent God, who created everything, is involved with man's world. And God's involvement is not in an abstract way, but in concrete ways involving real people, real events, real places on our real earth. The land of Israel is relatively small. Here, Israel's size, the blue shape, is compared to the size of the United States. Or compare the size of Israel to California here on the left. Or note on the right, Israel's landmass is about the same size as New Jersey, the 5th smallest state in the United States. But in spite of Israel's relatively small size, this little land has had a huge impact upon history. This is undoubtedly because of God's association with the land and people of Israel. The Lord says in Ezekiel 5:5, "This is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations, with countries all around her." God indicates in the scriptures that he would make himself known to the world through the people of Israel in the land of Israel. Events in this small land would give evidence that the God of the Bible is the true God and that there is no other. Map 12.1 in the Satellite Bible Atlas shows the borders of the modern countries in the Middle East. Let's take a closer look at Israel's position as a land bridge between 3 continents. Note the 2 ancient cradles of civilization, Mesopotamia and Egypt. The route between Mesopotamia and Egypt is funneled through the land of Israel because the Arabian Desert to the east and the Mediterranean Sea on the west present difficult obstacles for travel. As a land bridge between continents, the land of Israel has historically been coveted by big empires in Egypt and Asia. Any kingdom interested in expanding military, economic, or political interests would set its sights on Israel as a bridge for expansion. Later in history, Europe got into the picture. This is a well-chosen land for the Lord of the earth to demonstrate in sometimes subtle, yet concrete ways, his sovereignty over the kingdoms of men. The history of the Jewish people with the land of Israel is evidence that the God of the Bible is the true God who alone transcends time and space. Before we look closer at the land of Israel, there are a few other features and terms of the ancient Near East to be familiar with. We will use map 2.1, a map showing Abram's migration from Mesopotamia to Canaan, to mark out the Fertile Crescent. This is an area shaped like a crescent that extends from the Persian Gulf north along the Tigris and Euphrates river basins through modern Syria, and then down along the eastern Mediterranean seaboard. It is a land with enough water, either from rivers or rain, to produce crops. The Fertile Crescent is made up of 2 parts. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris. This is where Iraq is today, and in ancient times was the center of both the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. The other part of the Fertile Crescent is called the Levant, which is the eastern Mediterranean seaboard. Levant means raised up. The area is characterized by hills and valleys, plateaus and mountains, some over 9,000 feet in elevation. The Levant includes the land of Israel, which was called Canaan in Abraham's time. To briefly review the main concepts presented in this video, the land of the Bible is a real place on our earth. The Bible describes real people, real events, and real places. The Bible is a record of God's involvement with the real world of mankind. Next, the land of the Bible is situated as a land bridge between 3 continents. Empires in Asia, Africa, and Europe have coveted this land as a bridge for expansion. We mentioned that the central position of the land and people of Israel ultimately testifies to the transcendence and sovereignty of the God of the Bible. We also learned the location of the Fertile Crescent, including its 2 parts, Mesopotamia and the Levant. In our next video, we will
Again, that's just an introduction overview of the geography in and around Israel. And next week, we'll get into more maybe terrain and weather and things like that. But my question to you is, can you think of something or a part of geography that played a role in your reading about the battle and the conquest of Israel. And so I'm going to go ahead and invite you to unmute. And what do you think? Can you think of anything?
I was a little confused. Is New Jersey the smallest state? I thought it was Rhode Island.
He actually said it's the fifth smallest state in the United
Oh,
States.
fifth. Okay. All right. All right.
Mm-hmm. So can anybody think of how geography played a role in any of this part of the story?
You said something about the Israel. You meant Canaan, or did you mean Jericho?
In any of the promised land. Yes, you could call it Israel or Canaan or promised land. Yeah.
Well, it was hill country.
Mm.
So it was primarily hill country. So that was the main geography that they had to deal with when they first went out to conquer Jericho.
Right.
When you're moving over 1 million people, it's hard to navigate through rough terrain like the mountains and, over the rivers and slopes. So yeah, they had to take a different path to get to where they had to go because with women, children, animals, and
All right, put yourself on mute, please. If you got phones going off, TV.
they had to move in a certain direction because of the terrain. And like they had to go through the crescent, then they had to go through the other laboratory, whatever it was. They had to go through all that.
Right. Okay. So it had something to do with, or it affected how they navigated the terrain.
Travel.
Right. Okay.
And even where they had some of their wars, they had to be in certain locations. I mean, you just couldn't fight anywhere. So you had to have things routed around so they have a best advantage point.
Right. Okay. Okay. I was, go ahead. Go ahead. Somebody was about to say something. Okay. As I was reading this, I had to read it a couple of times when I was thinking about geography, and it struck me how they were able to move into place behind the Jordan River, and that was kind of their staging ground where they got ready. They were organized. At one point, they had to be circumcised. The men had to be circumcised, and they were able to do all that behind the protection of the Jordan River. So the Jordan River provided the Israelites with a natural barrier that protected them as they prepared for war. That was part of the geography. That is a lower story element that God provided to them in order to have his plan go forward, because they needed a place. 1 to 3 million people to get ready for war. Now, of course, everyone didn't go to war, but they needed somewhere safe to prepare for war. So the Jordan River was one thing that I thought of. The second thing I thought of was also, if you remember, the 2 spies that went to Jericho and also the surrounding area to spy out the land, to kind of get some intel before they go to war. Well, after their encounter with Rahab, they fled the city and they hid in the hills. Just like Denise said, it was hill. A lot of it is hill country. There's a central spine that goes down the middle of Israel. You'll probably see that next week. But they were given the geography. God had provided them a geography to allow them to hide from the people who are seeking after them, because somebody somehow the Canaanites found out about them, and they had to flee the city and hide for 3 days before they went back and told Joshua what they'd seen and heard. And so God used a lore story element of the geography of the hills to allow them to hide and to get back safely. Those are just two things that I thought about. And but as we go forward, I'm going to ask you to think about that. How does geography, including weather, how has God used that in order to advance his upper story plan? So just be aware of it, and we'll talk about that more. Now we have time for Randy Frazee, our regular lecturer, to reflect and give us some points on this part of the story. So let me set up my screen here, and we will get started here in just a second. And don't worry, I will put you on mute. And make sure to adjust your volume.
This is your story, this is my story, but most of all, this is the greatest story ever told. This is God's story. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give to them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go.
Can you think of a time in your life when you were faced with an overwhelming challenge right in front of you that you had to confront and it scared you to death? What did you do? Did you face it or did you retreat? I immediately think of the soldiers at Normandy and the fear that must have been racing through their minds and hearts as they were about to jump into the water and charge the beach on June the 6th, 1944. On the day before, General George Patton gives a chilling speech to the Third Army. Listen to just a part of his words to them. I do not want to get any messages saying I am holding my position. We are not holding. We are advancing constantly, and we are not interested in holding on to anything. Our basic plan of operation is to advance and to keep on advancing, regardless of whether or not we have to go over or under or through the enemy. Well, today in chapter 7 of the story, the Israelites are faced with such an overwhelming challenge. It's time for them to enter the land that God promised to give them 600 years earlier. The upper story plan of God must advance. But there's a problem. There are already people who possess the land. There are lots of them. They are wicked people who wouldn't think twice about cutting your head off, and apparently a bunch of them are giants, really tall people. In order to take possession of the land, they're going to have to take it from these people. 40 years earlier, 12 men from Israel went out to spy the land, saw these giants, and retreated. Joshua is now in charge. 4 times in the opening 4 paragraphs of chapter 7, God instructs Joshua to be strong and courageous. It was only Joshua and Caleb of the 12 who believed that they should have gone in 40 years ago, only 2 of the 12. This time Joshua decides to send in only 2 spies. You see, committees seldom make courageous decisions, but safe ones. It's time for a courageous decision. How could they possibly be strong and courageous in this circumstance? The odds are stacked completely against them. We learn in this chapter that they needed 3 things to succeed. First, they needed to be people of the word. God tells Joshua at the opening of this chapter, "Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful." You may recall that the only time they were unsuccessful is when Achan violated the instructions of God and kept some of the property or spoil of the people of Jericho for himself. Their second conquest, the city of Ai, failed. You might have noticed that when Joshua dealt with this situation and they conquered Ai the second time around, that Joshua gathered all the people together and he reads the word, the law. Here's what the story tells us. Afterward, Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived in the land among them. To avoid the Achan situation again, not only did Joshua need to be a man of the word, but all the people needed to be people of the word, to know it, to meditate on it, and to do what it says. This is the secret of success. Second, they needed to be people of prayer. God told Joshua, "You can be strong and courageous because the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." God is saying to Joshua, before you move forward, talk to me and make sure I'm going before you. There is no way you're going to beat these giants without me. You'll notice that in their first victory that the ark of the Lord, which represented God's presence, marched ahead of the army. Again, the only time they were unsuccessful is when Achan disobeyed the word of the Lord and secretively took the spoil for himself. The story tells us that God was not with them when they attacked Ai. The ark was absent. In order to be successful, they needed to constantly seek God to see if he was in on it. If he is, charge. If not, hold your position. Finally, they needed to be people identified with God. Before they engaged in their first battle, God instructed all the males to be circumcised. Circumcision outwardly identified them as belonging to God. This was something that the law instructed when a child is born, but they stopped doing it while they're in the wilderness. So before they began the conquest, all the males, young and old, were circumcised. We're told in the story that for a few painful days, the only able-bodied people in the camp were females. But when it was time for them to take off into battle, they were marked as belonging to God. With those 3 things in place, the battle begins. God dams up the Jordan River 16 miles upstream, enabling the nation of Israel to cross. They conquer Jericho first. After that, they conquer the city called Ai. Then they take out 5 kings and cities that came together against Israel. This is called the Southern Campaign. Then they move to the north and take out an alliance of 14 or so cities in the Northern Campaign. When it's all said and done, this is the report we receive. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. In the lower story, the giants are bigger than the Israelites, but in the upper story, God is bigger than the giants. We face battles in our own life. Like Joshua and the children of Israel, we need to be people of the Word. We need to look intently into God's Word to discover His will, to learn how to proceed, to find courage and to find strength. We need to be people of prayer. We need to ask God if we should move forward or hold our position. You see, prayer involves listening to God. If He's in it, charge. If He's not, hold your position. Finally, we need to be people identified with God. For us today, it means if we've come into a relationship with God through Christ on the inside, we need to publicly declare our devotion and allegiance to Him on the outside by being baptized, unashamedly identifying ourselves with God in private and in public. Remember, with God on our side, we will be successful. In the lower story, giants are bigger than we are, but in the upper story, God is bigger than our giants.
So I got a question for you. What part of Randy's teaching this evening encouraged you or challenged you? What stood out to you?
The statement that he made of the three things, that was very powerful and something to remember and walk with. That you need to be a person or people of the Word. You need to identify with God, and you need to be a person of prayer. But overall, I think what's most powerful was the statement that the upper story plan of God will advance.
Right.
Oh, what I think stood out to me was that last statement he made. That God is bigger than the giants.
Yeah.
So we get intimidated real easy. And I'm sure that the Israelites, they got intimidated, constantly going forward. And they had to have Moses and Joshua in front of them, ensuring them that God is going to fight the battles for them. So at the same time, we got to realize that God is going to fight the battle for us, because He's bigger than our giant.
Right. Yeah, it really depends on what you're looking at, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Are you focused on the lower story? Are you focused on the upper story? Not that you're ignoring the lower story, because lower story exists, but are you looking at the lower story through the lenses of the upper story, keeping the upper story in mind?
Mhm.
Yeah. And I did forget to tell you that you can make notes on page 68 of your study guide, fill in those blanks, and you'll have those notes. Go ahead. I think Carrie, you were about to say. No? Okay.
I was just checking. I was in agreement with you about the writing, taking notes.
Okay.
Yeah. I also like it, Paul, when we had to learn how to proceed, and we need to check with God on how to proceed. If He says go, we go. If He says stay, we need to stay.
Right. Yeah, I like the words he used. If God says go, charge. It's a military.
Yeah, there you go. If He said go,
military
charge.
term,
That's it.
advance, like General Patton, advance. But if God says doesn't say, then just hold your ground. Just stay right there. Yeah, that's good.
True. It's great.
Any other comments or questions?
But it's amazing how when Achan stole some of the spoils and hid it for himself, God already knew. So He talked to Joshua. He told Joshua what was going on. And He told Joshua, the next battle that you fight, you're going to lose. because they disobeyed. Because he said, wipe out everything and everybody. Don't leave nothing or anything.
Mm. Mm.
Obedience.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Obedience is better than sacrifice.
All right, preacher. All right. Well, I really hope that in this particular Bible study session that you really got a taste for how in the story of Joshua, it really showed the upper story of God's provision and protection for his people. That's the focus. That's the central part, is that God provided what they need and he protected them as long as they obeyed. And so, yes, God is marching forward. His plan is marching forward, and he gives us the privilege and the responsibility of cooperating with him in doing that. And so he has chosen us to cooperate in that in this particular plan that he has. And so in our personal time this week, we are going to go forward, and you can take a look at pages 71 through 75 in your study guide. Now that the battle has begun and pretty much ended, now we have a few good men and women. We start getting into the judges. So on pages 71 to 75 of your study guide, go ahead and do that during your personal time. Any last minute questions or comments before I say goodbye to our recording students? All right, well, live students, if you'll just hold up for just a second, let me say goodbye to our recording students. Thank you so much for watching this, all 3 videos and the discussion. If you need anything, call the church office, and I pray that we'll see you for either the live event, our Bible study on Wednesday night starting at 6, or see you, that you'll have a chance to see the next video. So thank you so much. Bye.